Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. It's 6 o'clock, and so not everybody that signed up is here yet, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for taking the time to engage in this webinar about church planting. This is part of the Learn, Pray, Join initiative of Mennonite Church USA, where we're focusing on peace church planting during the months of March and April. My name is Michael Danner. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality for Mennonite Church USA, and I'm the host, which basically means I'm going to welcome you all and then turn it over to folks from Mennonite Mission Network who are engaged in this. We will have some time for some question and answer at the end, so if you want to, there's a chat feature in Zoom, and so you can open that up and write questions as we go, or you can just record your questions, and when we're done, we'll let you open up your mics and ask questions in that format as well. I want to introduce two folks from Mennonite Mission Network that will be a part of tonight's presentation. The first one is Carla Mentor, who is a church relations rep for Mennonite Mission Network, and also Mauricio Chinlo, who is the Minister for Church Planting for Mennonite Mission Network as well. And so at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mauricio.
Yeah, hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. I'm the Minister for Church Planting with Mennonite Mission Network. I've been doing this work since January 2009, so that's about 10 years. First, I would like just to say that the main motivation for doing this work, myself, Mission Network team, and the church planters, missional leaders I know, it's a strong sense of call coming from God with a notion like biblical notions like the Word became flesh, as the Father has sent me, I'm sending you, and the resurrected Jesus sent his disciples. God's love for the world. There are all kind of biblical imagery, the parable of the four soils, about the notion that the main purpose of the church is to be a blessing to the world. So that's it's the main motivation. I just came back from Exponential in Orlando last week. It's a gathering of church planters and missional leaders, 5,000 people, pretty much evangelical. But it's just amazing how many of these folks, they believe that they have been sent into their own context to be a missional presence. Most of the church planters we call it church planting. We have discussed this for a long time within the executive board, Mennonite Mission Network. Church planting is the best way to call it. We can't find a better term, but the idea is that, we're talking about missional leaders and missional churches and missional conferences. And most of the people I know, like what we're going to hear immediately from Bern, Rampel in Colorado, Denver, Colorado, Hilda, Palacios in West Palm Beach. Most of these folks are normally, they are bivocational folks. They are self-motivated. They are folks who have this inner call to be a presence in their communities, to engage with the gospel. So most of these folks, as I said, they come from, some have theological education. Bern is theologically educated, but most of them are just regular folks in regular careers, offices that feel this call. For example, here in North Carolina, where I live in Raleigh, the Raleigh Mennonite Church was planted by the Durham Mennonite Church, and the Durham Mennonite Church was planted by some Mennonite carpenters that they were not trained in theology or any of that. The other thing that is very interesting in our church, in the larger church, is that we have like three groups of leaders. One are the millennials, younger folks who are really attracted normally to form radical or intentional communities. Prophetic peace and justice is a very strong theme. Then we have immigrant communities a lot, in the larger cities of the U.S. like Los Angeles, Miami, New York. We have significant number of Hispanic, Asian, and African planters. I was 3 weeks ago. I was in Los Angeles, and there are a number of African churches. Very interesting. We don't have a lot of churches in our system that have intentionally planted other churches. That's kind of unusual among Mennonites. Most of the churches that you find in the last 50 years in urban areas, they were planted by displaced Mennos from Kansas, Indiana, Pennsylvania, that went to these places for work or for education. They wanted to sing hymns together. They wanted to have the potluck. They wanted to do the Mennonite thing. So that's how many churches were started in different parts of the country. But now in the last, I would say 10 to 15 years, we have seen something unusual, like something organic, something that is coming from the ground up. We also have people, for example, here, we've got quite a few Dukies from Duke that, they have contacted us and say, how can I pastor a Mennonite church? And I normally tell them, well, if you're going to be in the Carolinas, you probably need to plant a church, to have a Mennonite church. So the Mennonite Church USA, as I said, on Mennonite Mission Network, we have been working on, okay, how do we network these folks in a way that we kind of sort of develop this sense of identity, this sense of community, and this sense of learning from each other. So we created 4 years ago the SENT event. It's a networking event every year. We try to connect with a local church plant that is kind of new and unique. We try to host the conference in collaboration with that church plant, with the leaders, with the conference from that region. So we have 3 of those already, and we're going to have the 4th one now in April 26 to 28 in Denver, Colorado. It's going to be hosted by Beloved Community. So that has been a very interesting space because we have gathered people from very diverse backgrounds, racially diverse, culturally diverse, professionally diverse. A lot of women, church planting women. That's very interesting. That has been really encouraging for us at the network and also at the Mennonite Church USA. As a development of byproduct of those gatherings, we created something that is going to be released in April. It's called the SENT Network Resource. It's a training resource for church planters that has basically 3 phases. That is, explore, equip, and send. So we have designed these teaching modules that we agree among different leaders, conferences, and church planters. There are key concepts or key notions that are needed to be equipped as a church planter. And we are also working at the denominational Mennonite Mission Network level on having a budget to kind of have seed money for these projects. And also we are working with human resources on how to process incoming new church planters that they're going to be like, let's call them national missionaries or missionaries. So we're kind of at the point in which there's a lot of talk about church decline or how the churches are dying, or and we with here in my work, at least, we have sort of switched the focus. Instead of talking about church decline, we are talking about multiplication, mobilization, equipping leaders. There's greater collaboration between the denomination, the conferences, and the churches and the church planters. I always use the image of, I love, soccer. I play soccer for a long time. I don't play anymore, but if you're gonna have some sort of team sport called soccer, you need the players, you need the coach, you need the club, and you need the league. So here we are having, we have the players, the church planters, we have some coaches, we have some clubs, the conferences, and we have the league that is the Mennonite Mission Network, Mennonite Church USA. So we need greater collaboration in order to have the game play. We are not competing, we are collaborating here. But many times when we have players out there doing their own thing, coaches, coming with their own strategies, and clubs, thinking that they are the most important part of the world, and the bigger structure, the agency, and the executive board doing their own plans, and we don't connect, we don't talk to each other. So I think we are coming to a point in where we start to understand that in order to have this game that we call the church and the body of Christ present on earth and planting peace churches, we need greater collaboration. So now I want to stop here and introduce Bern Rempel. He's a friend from Denver, Colorado. He can introduce himself. It's a very interesting story call, because it's not one of those typical calls of the church planters I know. Bern has been for over 30 years a senior pastor of different churches, and now he's getting this call to create a new community. So Bern, please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? Or no?
We can't hear you.
Yeah. I heard you for a moment, but then you went out again.
Okay, you're on now.
There we go.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I had been a senior pastor for many years, which means I surely must have started when I was 15, because I'm still young. But I have been able to work with a new church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania at first. And then I worked with an established congregation in the center of Denver. And I had been there almost 19 years when I left to start a new church. But 4 years before that, I began to get my call. And my call came through kind of two key pathways. One was that I started doing work with the Courage and Renewal movement, which is based in Parker Palmer's writings, the Quaker writer Parker Palmer, writing books like Hidden Wholeness and so on, somewhat based on Thomas Merton. And I went to hear Parker, and his theme was see how they love each other. Then a couple of months later, through the work of our then conference minister, Herm Weaver, I was sitting across the table from Ted Haggard, who was back in Colorado to start a new church after going through rehabilitation following his disgrace with drugs and some sexual encounters here. And I had no idea what to say to Ted. And so I asked him, Ted, how do you start a church? Or how do you make a church grow? And his answer astonished me because it sounded like Parker Palmer's answer. His answer to me was, the leaders have to love each other. And I realized in all the years that I had been a senior pastor that I had never really directly asked the question of myself with my fellow leaders, do we love each other? I'm talking about fellow pastoral leaders, but also lay leaders on councils and this sort of thing. And so Ted's answer really floored me and filled out what I had heard from Parker Palmer. And I was fortunate that my wife and I were able to go on a road trip after that. And we spoke for about 5,000 miles about this question of love, and came back convinced that it was all about love, much more than I had realized. It wasn't about being practical and doing church and just bringing casseroles and just fixing barns, but it was actually about taking delight in the Holy Spirit, in each other. And for me, this created a kind of late middle age renovation of my theology. And so for me, the phrase that I came to pay attention to was delighted love. Kind of like Psalm 1, blessed are those who delight in the law of the Lord. It turns out delight is a big word in the Bible, and I started paying attention to that. The passage that emerged for me was Romans 5, where we are justified by faith. And so we have peace with God, and therefore we boast in our sufferings, and suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. And then Paul brings it home with, because the love of the Holy Spirit has been poured into our hearts. I started noticing passages like this in a way that I had not noticed before. And the same with Paul in 2 Thessalonians. He begins his passage, I pray and thank God daily for the faith that I see growing among you and for the love that you have for each other. So again, this question of love, and this was the nature of my call. And it took some convincing. It took about 3.5 years before I was ready to accept the call. I resisted it a lot because I really liked my secure position, which I thought I would continue to have until I retired. And I also, in several ways, needed to test the call, which I did through some different kinds of worship experiences that I started creating. But finally, I accepted it. And that was like jumping off a cliff. So one of the questions Mauricio has, or that we were given for this, is what are some of the characteristics of being a leader who wants to be involved in church planting? And I think one of the characteristics I discovered, besides having a transforming call, which is what it was for me with this question of love, was also willingness to take risk. And this was part of the delay for me. I was not willing to take the risk for quite a while. And when I did, my wife and I went down to Santa Fe, and I was sitting in the hotel room for about half a day pondering what in the world had I done. I was kind of at the bottom of the barrel right then. So risk, I think, has been a big factor for me. I would almost say, to paraphrase Paul, I don't say I would boast in our risks, but I would say that we celebrate our risks, because risks produce endurance, and endurance produces character, character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. This question of risk is not exactly suffering directly, but it did plunge me into periodic depression, which I had also never experienced before this. And so I knew that apparently I was onto something real for myself, that this was a real risk, and I was doing something really different with my life. I have also needed to become bivocational, as Mauricio mentioned. And I am now, my primary bivocational work is as a hospice chaplain for the Denver Hospice, which is a great privilege, and I really love that work. I also am a courage and renewal facilitator, and so in this work, I lead retreats, and I am also a consultant for the United Methodists. But that work is more periodic and sporadic. My regular bivocational work is with the hospice. And I would say being bivocational is both distracting and inspiring. I can draw on experiences that I have from the other work that I do. Church planting is in many ways very engaging, and I would love to be able to spend more time just paying attention to it. But I also feel like being bivocational is actually a good model. Having been a pastor for so many decades, I observed a number of churches that were just planted through grants from conferences. And I think there's something about needing to locate a church plant within leaders who have a sense of call and risk. And that wasn't always the case with the older church planting model, where grants were simply in place. Having said that, I have felt terrified of the uncertainty in my life from time to time. And also, having said that, I think uncertainty is good for me. It has been good for me. And it has been part of my call. Let's see, I have one more. Pitfalls and challenges. I think another quality of a church leader is to be able to sustain failure and then to keep on circling back until something works. I have experienced multiple failures in this work already. And we are a very small church. I've experienced many miracles, and it seems to me that the miracles of God go hand in hand with failure. I don't fully pretend to understand this paradox, but I am living it and experiencing it. Somehow there is a dependency on the Holy Spirit that comes with moving through failure, which is something I had not experienced by just going to school and getting graduate degrees and getting good church jobs. And so I think those are woven together in some way. I would say also one of the miracles I've experienced is this opportunity to work with our Mexican pastors, Becky and Fur, who are from Mexico City, experienced pastors and conference leaders. And they are a wonder to work with. In going into this intercultural work, it's created another season of sifting in our little congregation. And so some people have been less involved and other people have become more involved. And in a tiny congregation where we are just sifted and sifted, change is the order of the day. I believe that it is change in the Spirit of Christ. And I particularly believe this in this intercultural work that Fernando and Rebecca, Becky and Fur, and I are trying to do together. We find that we share a great deal of uncertainty. We don't have a clear path. Mauricio has given us a lot of support, but he has not handed us 3 steps toward becoming an intercultural church. It's just not that easy or straightforward. And so we are finding our way, and this will be part of the exploration that we'll be reflecting when folks come here for Cent 2019. I hope that we can give some flavor and experience of that. Having said all of that, I would say this is a rich and wonderful experience of the Holy Spirit, and I am grateful to God for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bern. Now we're going to move on to Hilda Palacios Zapata from West Palm Beach. Go ahead, Hilda.
West Palm Beach, Florida. And our church, we started back in 2012, just as friends sitting together and talking about personal situations that was happening in our lives. Then as the time progressed, this conversation continued, and then it started to take form. We really didn't know what was happening, but one of my friends was visiting a church, Evangelical Garifuna Mennonite Church in Miami, and she was introduced to the pastors, and they came to West Palm Beach. And from that point on, they started noticing how we were all gathered together, even our children were playing around, and they began supporting us in terms of giving us idea to let us know that this is actually the beginning of a church. So we continue, we listened, we followed through. We received a lot of support from them. Within a short time, we moved from one house to another, serving. But a little bit prior to that, one of my friends that it's a therapist, a clinical therapist, she works around the community, and we were just meeting people. She was meeting people and bringing those people in, and they were doing clinical work. And they started doing it at home. And from that point on, the church, the amount of people just started to get larger. We moved from going to the house to a school, and we started opening up where we started working in the community. When we were working in the community, we started working with two communities. One is Rainbow, the other one is Casa del Monte. And we went there and we started serving the community by gathering information in terms of immigration, teaching, for information about for their students, for their children. Some of the women there were going through difficult times in their marriage. Many of them do not know their rights. So we were helping them. As we were helping them, we had to do a lot of research to be able to help them. Along the way, there were, one of the questions that is here, it says, what are the features of a church leader? We noticed that we were starting to be formed. Each of us were working in different areas. I was one of the teachers. So as the teacher, I started working with the youth, with the children. My other sister was working with the youth. Another sister was working with the entire church group. And then along the way, as we were working, we started to notice that some of us had the call for being a pastor. And so they went into that role of being a pastor. They were studying. We began to receive information from the Evangelical Garifuna Church Mennonite in Miami about the EVA classes. So we started taking EVA classes. We started to inform ourselves about the EVA classes. Then, short while, we started to noticing the challenges that we were facing. It was a small group of women, and there was a lot to do. And we were kind of like really tight in terms of who was going to take care of all of these areas within the church. We try to manage it as best as we could. Then there's another question here that says, the pitfalls. In the pitfalls that we face were the miscommunication between the mother church and our church. We were getting misinformation between the leaders that it became so hurtful. We didn't know which way to go. We didn't know who to turn to. And it became to the point, it got to the point where we didn't want to continue with the church as it stands right now. The church has been closed, but each of us are going in a way that we're still serving the Lord, we're still serving our God, and we pray that everything falls back into place the way it had started. But we really worked as best as we could. None of us at the time had any theological courses or education. Some of us are going towards it, and from all of these patterns that we experienced, all of these experiences that we went through, even though it was hurtful, we all moved on, and there was a lot of healing that took place, because when you get a call from God to work with a group to continue and to serve the community, and it doesn't seem to fall through, you at one point feel like a failure, feel like you failed God. I actually did. And I also could relate to what Vern said. You fall into a depression and you don't know how to come out of that depression because the pain is so deep. You know, you have this deep desire of helping everyone that comes around your way, everyone you meet. You have this deep desire within you to help, to serve. And it didn't happen that way. And so that was the painful part. But thank God that we were able to get back together, talk about certain things, be able to begin our own healing process, because we really didn't know who to reach out for help. We really didn't know how to handle it. We didn't know how to begin the healing process. And when we did, it was good. We were able to move on. We were able to see what we did right, what we did wrong. And that was the part that I really like, because I'm still in the healing process. I'm still in the healing process because this is not something that you heal overnight. You get triggers every once in a while, you know, and I remind myself that God has a purpose in my life, and that's what has kept me going.
Thank you, Hilda. Thank you for sharing. Now it's time for Carla Minter from Elkhart. The mic.
Okay. I think it's helpful for those of you listening to notice how different the call was for Vern and the call for Hilda. And these are the kinds of examples of the excitement that we're seeing in congregations and conferences for church planting, but it doesn't all look the same. If you don't feel like a church planter, maybe your call is more like Hilda's, where she says, we were just friends sitting and talking about our lives. That's a church planter. And Vern talked more about an individual call and response and taking the risk to do that. So there are many ways that people follow that impulse to create new communities of faith. And thank you, Hilda and Vern, for offering those rich examples. In 2017, the church relations representatives with Mennonite Mission Network talked to every conference in MCUSA and asked, how's it going? What are you doing with church planting? And what kind of resources would you like? And it is out of those conversations that the SENT network has been developed. There was a request for training modules, for mentoring, for networking. And so this is a resource that's in response to the needs that congregations and conferences have identified. What's important to remember is that conferences are unique and congregations are unique. And so what one conference may benefit from SENT may not be what another conference needs. So this is a very flexible tool. You don't have to go through the whole process. There may be a component that will enrich what you are already doing in your conference. So we see that as a very organic, rich resource. For example, Hilda just said it's a very difficult time when there was miscommunication and then actually the closing of the church plant, and her comment was, we didn't know where to go. So if she would have had a coach, she would have had someone to go to and say, now what? And then resources could have been provided, which thank goodness, Hilda, you did find the resources and you've been to some SENT conferences, and we're very happy that the journey continues. Let me give you an example of some of the excitement that I'm hearing out in conferences and congregations. And like Mauricio said, we're feeling like it's a new place. And I did not hear these conversations even 5 years ago when I started working with Mennonite Mission Network. Just in the last 2 weeks, I've had a conference who's very excited about missional leadership. They're engaged with a missional discipleship initiative, which is a tool within the SENT network process. They're looking at creating new communities of faith, new Anabaptist communities, peace churches. I was tapped on the shoulder by an experienced woman pastor who said, I don't know where to go, but I've been feeling like I could encourage and support a church planter. I don't think I'm the one, but how do I encourage others to do this? And she wasn't sure where to go. And so when people are mentioning those kind of things, we would say, this is where you come to the SENT network. This is a starting point. Another pastor said, we could so easily begin a second congregation in our university town. He said, we're ready. The need is there. People are hungry. People are hurting. We have the opioid epidemic. There are problems with addictions and hopelessness, and we feel like our message brings hope into the world. And we're ready. But where do we start? What should we do? And so the SENT network is a starting point for people who want to explore how to create new communities of faith, and specifically Anabaptist peace churches. Another exciting things just seem to be happening all at once. For instance, just in my conversations, there are 4 more urban areas that are saying we want to plant peace churches, and these are specifically on campuses, like university campuses. So that's interesting. Rural areas, urban areas, both. But most people say we don't know where to start. So I would say start with the SENT network. That's what we would like you to know with this webinar. This is the place to start. And as Mauricio has already said, what you'll find when you go into the SENT network, it'll be online, and there's 3 phases, similar to what Vern said. The process of call, which we're calling explore. Explore, equip, and then send. So come and explore your call, and there will be training modules and also tools within that, spiritual formation. There's a process that each of these sections have. So you explore your call, you become equipped to carry it out, and then you are sent to create new communities of faith. So that's the movement. And maybe like in Hilda's case, maybe their church plant was up and running and doing well, but they wanted to look at the SENT portion, which talks more about the hands-on things to consider for developing a congregation. And there'd be some tools there. To be more specific, people have been asking, so when does this start? The SENT conference, and I think we can probably include a link for that with this webinar. As Vern said, he's going to be hosting, his congregation will be hosting the SENT conference this April 26 to 28, 2019 in Denver. Please come. The SENT conference is a place where you can come and meet other people. At Mission Network, we like to say that we create the space. And we've seen how people come together and resource one another, get encouraged, and then take that information back home and foster additional growth. We're very, very glad for that. So come to the SENT conference. This year after the SENT conference, we'll be beginning the SENT network with a group of people. We don't know how many. So there will be a place eventually where you can go online and submit your name and say, I want to be a part of this learning community or cohort. We imagine that there will be a process, maybe approximately 6 months with the live training modules, but then there's also coaching and immersion in other ways. There'll be additional resources in addition to the training modules and the coaching, and then also connected with what you're actually doing. If you want to know more information, you can certainly contact myself or Mauricio, and any of your church relations representatives through Mission Network will field your interest, and we'll be sure you get to the right place. Right now, the Sent network is not online yet, but it will be. So at this point, just give your interest to us, and we'll happily keep in conversation with you. So we'll provide those contact information. And I'm happy to take questions too, but I think that's a good start for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. If you're on the call, if you have your chat feature up, it'll open a dialog box on the right side. Kayla just put up a link to the Sent conference, which you can go to, which is on the Mennonite Mission Network website. As part of the Peace Church Planting Learn, Pray, Join initiative, in March and April, we're asking people to pray specifically in 3 areas. First, to pray for Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Mission Network's church plants, that those plants would thrive and kind of become all that God's called them to be. Also, to pray for those who are sensing a call to church planting. That can be individuals that maybe are sensing a tap on the shoulder from the Spirit to plant a church, or from a congregation that thinks, hey, maybe we would like to invest in a church plant, to be a partner church, or like Carla shared the story of the woman who said, I feel that I could help someone in church planting. Maybe I'm not the planter, but I could help someone else. So pray for those that are sensing a call to church planting, or some sort of nudge to get engaged in church planting in whatever form that is. And then also pray especially for active church planters, those that are out there like Vern and like Hilda, that are doing this work, which is not easy work. They both, I said, it can be very rewarding, and also there's no easy pathway from point A to point B. And so sometimes it's challenging. Sometimes church planters feel very much alone. And so pray for church planters in the midst of this work. The other thing we're asking people to do is consider ways that they might support Peace Church Planting. One real tangible way is to support a church planter to attend the Sent 2019 conference. And so there's information on Mennonite Church USA website. If you go there and look up church planting, I don't know, Kayla, if you can put that link up there as well. But $65 will pay for one person's registration. If your church has resources and you want to send somebody, that would be helpful. $320 pays for 2 nights lodging. As you can tell, being a church planter is not a real lucrative thing to do either. And so sometimes to get to the spaces where you can get the kind of support you need takes resources that a lot of church planters don't have. And so this is one way that your church can help support church planting, is by supporting people to attend the Sent conference. And so, and then also consider, for those of you, I assume that those of you on this webinar have some interest in church planting. And so maybe explore that further. What do you feel God calling you to do? What kind of nudges do you have? What brings you into this space? And how can you flesh out that calling and conversations with Mauricio, who spends a lot of time with church planters and engaging other church planters, and also, as Carla mentioned, the church relations reps that are assigned to your conferences that you can talk to about that as well. You can email me, and then I'll just send you to Mauricio, or one of the church relations reps. So they're the ones that are on the front lines of doing this kind of work. So I see on the right that there's some questions. One's from Brooke Musselman, and I'll just read the questions, and then we'll see who wants to answer, of Carla or Mauricio as well. Does Sent provide any resources for churches looking for revitalization? Our area is pretty saturated with Mennonite churches, many of which are experiencing decline amid this shifting culture.
Yeah, I can answer that. We have one of the units, modules and equipment is written by Matt Shaden from Defiance Church in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And he wrote this specifically for folks who want to restart traditional churches. Matt, he's a young pastor that was invited by a declining church in Glenwood Springs. That's 2 or 3 hours from west of Denver. This church was a church that was originally started by a voluntary service unit. The church had a building. They have 15 faithful Mennonite members, but they didn't know what to do. They invited this young couple. Matt attended the seminary, Seattle Seminary. Matt came there and worked with them in a plan for what we call legacy churches. But basically, to make a long story short, in 4 years, they kind of switch a lot of things. They have to learn a lot of new things. But they went from 15 members to 55, from a budget of 25,000 to 125,000. The church is really thriving. There are a lot of young couples. These planters, they are young. They have 2 young children. So naturally, the planters, they attract people like them. And another interesting development for areas where you're heavily populated with Mennonite churches in decline is the experience of the journey in Kansas with Howard Wagler. Howard is a long-term pastor that kind of came out of the rural churches in central Kansas. Hutchinson is a place where they work, and Howard is really a good coach and a good resource for folks who are in these areas where they have buildings, churches in decline, and they really don't know what to do. Howard will be a great resource. But yes, we are working on that.
Thanks, Mauricio. Yeah, and that's also something that we do at Mennonite Church USA Leadership Development Office. That's some of the work that I actually do as well. It's not formally attached to the CENT network, but I just did a revitalization seminar in Portland. I also did another one day-long in Virginia, and did a 1-hour seminar at Ohio Mennonite Conference on this topic of revitalizing existing churches. For me personally, I for 18 years pastored one of these churches, a legacy church in decline, and worked at revitalization in that context and some of the leadership moves, and some of the ways that you can get at that. So you can feel free to contact me about that too. And we'll, in this, probably in 2019, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have some resources coming out of leadership development on revitalization of what, like Mauricio refers to as legacy churches, mostly existing kind of white churches in rural Mennonite clusters that are experiencing decline. So, so that's something we're aware of. That's a strong need in the church, but also I think for me the question highlights the need for. There are some places where there's lots of Mennonite churches clustered, and then there's some places where there's not many Mennonite churches at all. And so I'm most excited about seeing peace churches planted in places where there aren't currently expressions of peace churches. And so, and among peoples that aren't typically thought of, people groups as Mennonite, quote unquote. And so a lot of the move of the spirit of the Mennonite church is in church plants among racial ethnic groups and all kinds of different communities and folks from different places. And that's pretty exciting. So a question from Ben Lamb: what kind of members are new church planted congregations attracting?
I thought I'd take that one. Which, Michael, your testimony right there, I think fits in with that. When I've talked with church planters at CENT conferences, basically the church planter is reaching out to people that he understands, he or she understands. And Michael's passion, I think, fits some of your own story. When I see a young millennial who overcame some adversity and maybe had really been frustrated with the church and now has found something new, that's exactly the people that he's going for. Women looking for like bringing friends together to have conversations, sometimes in a coffee shop or something. They don't know they're starting a church, but they're looking for that kind of connection and relationship because that's what they need. So I've really noticed that the churches end up looking a lot like the church planter. And we have all kinds of church plants and church planters. So I would say it's a very diverse, exciting denomination when you look at the church plants. So I hope, Ben, that answers your question.
Yeah, and then the next question from Drew Marshall. I wanted to ask Vern if he could talk more about testing the call, what that means, and how he did it.
Okay, am I on now?
You are on, sir.
Okay, thanks. I feel like in some ways I just tested the call by resisting it, which I guess if you look at the prophets, that's a very biblical way to go. But part of what I did is just one specific detail will illustrate it, I think, is I started going to some more Pentecostal evangelical style churches of some friends that I had. And I found myself being very moved by the style of the service. And my own musical love is for the blues and for Mennonite hymn singing, which I grew up with. Strangely enough, I grew up with both of those musical forms ever since I'm a small child. But I began to wonder if I could put together a worship service that would use some of that music. And so I began practicing that by creating a secondary worship service at First Mennonite, where I was the senior pastor at the time, just to see how that would feel. And so that was another way of testing the call, was to see if that was just an imaginary kind of thing, or if it actually could be real. That's one example of it. There were many other aspects. Some of them I would call psychological and spiritual, and others were more social. I had to decide if I had the inner courage to jump into this, and so I needed to test that in several ways. I also had lots of conversations with people to see if this was a real thing from other people's point of view as well. So that's kind of how that would be a short answer to it, I suppose.
Thank you. Corbin asks an interesting question, and we'll see who wants to respond. When does a church plant become a church? Is it day one, or does it happen at some point along the way? And how do you know? I'll just wait. I'm a day one guy. So, and the rest of you go.
There is that answer depends on which conference you are talking to, but I always say we are a confederation of tribes, or tribal federation in the Mennonite Church USA. So, but basically what I know is, for example, Virginia Mennonite Conference, where I used to belong in my church, Lancaster, Western District, what else? Pacific Southwest, probably many other conferences. They have something called church information guideline. Some of them, they have very structured guidelines. Others are learning to do it. But normally, yeah, conferences will have guidelines for this. We haven't developed any guidelines at the executive board or the Mennonite Mission Network, because we believe that those kind of guidelines need to develop by, again, using the imagery of the club that is the conference. But as part of this dialogue, intertribal dialogue that we have now on this issue, we might come up with some sort of a standard guideline for all the peace churches and conferences. It's kind of difficult to develop that kind of document, but typically we talk about a 3-year period to launch a church. And for example, in equipping and send the network resource that we have created, I wrote specifically 2 modules on how to launch a new church and how to develop a proposal to the conference or the supporting churches.
Yeah. My more quick answer of day one is kind of rooted in my experience as a conference minister in Illinois Mennonite Conference. And what we noticed there is that early on they had some formal guidelines, and one of those guidelines is that within 3 years the church would be self-supporting, that they would be able to hire a full-time pastor, and that they would own a church building. Well, what we found over time is that was impossible for many new churches, especially in urban areas in Chicago and among immigrant churches. And so there was baked into the system or the definition of a church this bias against immigrant churches. And so we started to measure whether it was a church or not more theologically, and that is it a gathering? Is it a gathering of believers who are baptized, committed to one another, practicing or observing the sacraments in the church in public worship, and some of those kinds of things to try to determine whether or not it's a church. So we would actually talk about young churches sometimes, and I would even some people talk about legacy churches. I would say what a 185-year-old Mennonite church is just a really old church plant. But I think it's a really interesting question, and some of the socioeconomic, cultural kind of frameworks that we're used to in the traditional or more formal conferences like Virginia, Lancaster, Western District, don't really play out in other conferences. So I would encourage us to try to look at maybe some more theological underpinnings for when is a church that don't have to do with pennies and pews and budgets and buildings and some of those more traditional measures that don't serve us too terribly well. Are there others that want to weigh in on that question?
I thought maybe Hilda had something to say.
Yes, I actually did. I actually do. So it says, when does a church plant becomes a church? Is it day one, or does it happen at some point along the way? I believe it happens along the way, because for my experience, once we were meeting in the school, we had guidelines. The recommendations and the support that we received came with guidelines on when we were going to start. We had a schedule when was going to be the preaching part, when it was going to be the songs, and when the children were going to take place to go to another room so they could start their own service. So there were guidelines that helped us to see that the church was actually forming. And that was where we actually noticed that the guidelines were every Sunday. And along the way, it started to increase, but it was quite the same. And it was really nice. And then he said, well, how do you know? I guess you just have this feeling that everything is going the right way. You have this feeling that everything is just put into place like puzzles, like this fits here. The preaching service goes here. The sermon goes on this side. And it's this strong feeling that you have. And that's what I can share.
The other thing it's important to remember is that we talk in this work ministry, we talk about different models. So, when you are working with, my experience is when you're working with, for example, millennials, that they are more attracted to sort of house churches, having a meal, playing music, drinking beer together, that kind of thing. When you have that kind of model, it's more organic, more kind of informal. It's not a conventional sort of church plant as we used to know in the past. So you have to keep in mind that the context, the type of leadership, how they interact with the conference. I think that's something we'll have to face we are facing right now and in the future. That church in post-Christendom is going to be quite different to what we know from the churches in the 50s and 60s. It's going to be something really, really different. It's going to be smaller, more organic, more kind of non-attached to a denominational identity. is going to be sort of, I don't know, like sometimes like rich or rural type of communities in some places, depending on the context, you know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mauricio. And are you willing to help congregations or church plants navigate those cultural shifts, Mauricio, or is that just so they know? Yeah.
Well, that's a very complicated matter. But you know, our nation, I love the U.S. is such a, you know, thing. I grew up in Argentina, you know, but when you are from outside the U.S., people think that the U.S. is a kind of monolithic thing, culture that is sold through Hollywood movies, kind of that kind of thing. But when you start to kind of hit the ground, the road, and get to know the different communities of our nation, you know, it's such a diverse continent, and there are so many nuances and flavors, and it's just amazing. I love it, but at the same time, it's really challenging to have, for example, a small denomination like ours, and to bring a whole of all that diversity. It's a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Is there any other questions that anyone would like to ask? Just you can unmute your microphone and feel free to speak if you like, or anything else you want to put up on the group chat. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. Anything else for Mauricio or Hilda, Vern, or Carla? Or Drew, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if there'll be kind of like a follow-up email or something that would have some of these links that we can go back to and return to, and kind of alert us when the aspects of the Send network is available to put yourself into online. So.
Yeah, that's going to be released. Drew, yeah, you're going to learn about all this pretty soon. And Drew, I haven't seen you register for Send 2019. I would love to have you and others. So I encourage you to register and come. And also, if you guys, church planters, because they are bivocational, we have some funding to help you guys to come over with help you with the travel expenses and the hotel, all that. So get back to me and we can talk about that.
Absolutely. Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Someone kind of coming from the outside, I don't have a Mennonite background or even an Anabaptist background. I'm intentionally moving in that direction. And I have spoke to Sue, I think is her name, earlier, and kind of submitted myself to the denomination. But what would that process look like as far as church planting with Mennonites as well? Or is that a conversation that you guys have had as far as, I think Anabaptist theology is very attractive to people my age. I'm 36, and people who are younger than me. And this seems like a great tool to that end. Is that part of the ethos of what you guys are doing here?
Yeah, we are working intentionally on that educational resource, and we are also working with Mennonite Mission Network program, human resources. You know, we're going to process folks like you through the Send network, the educational part, coaching, seeing if you are part of the conference, where you're living, if you have any church that could become a sort of a sending church to form a ministry support team. We are also going to kind of process you theologically, you know, your personal background, everything. Like, we're going to treat you like a national missionary. You know, Mission Network, we have a lot of experience with international missionaries for a long time, a long history. I was one of them in Ecuador for some years, and we're going to kind of follow the same process, but we're going to do this in collaboration, a strong collaboration with the executive board, with the denominational ministers like Michael and Sue, and also with the conference and the local church. Yeah, but all that's in process. Yeah. If you come to Colorado, you're going to learn much more about that.
He's the consummate salesman. But yeah, I would just echo what Mauricio is saying, is that traditionally the church planting has happened through conferences. There's a system called the MLI process where people traditionally get in. It's what you would have engaged with Sue. And we're looking at ways to make that MLI process more adaptable and flexible for different kinds of vocational ministry. So from chaplaincy to traditional congregational ministry to church planting, we want to have one centralized tool that kind of makes it possible for us to get the right support for church planners, for pastors, and get you connected to conferences and existing congregations. And so, but we're bringing kind of two systems together that haven't really been together. And so it's an exciting time, and it's also sometimes a little less clear than we would probably like some days, but it's developing really, really well. And so, yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, to Drew, there are a lot of other young pastors that are similar to Drew's situation. They found the Mennonite Church because of the Anabaptist theology, including the peace position, the community. Community is key, and also a greater opportunity for women in ministry. A lot of things that the Mennonite Church has been doing for decades is the direction that some of the church planting, the larger evangelical church planters are leaning toward, putting Jesus at the center and the story of the Gospels at the center. And we have a long history of that and really much to offer the church in the world at this time. So Drew, I'd really encourage you to get to know people. I've met many pastors like you who are first generation pastors of Mennonite churches. And James is asking, he's just acknowledging that he's also a part of a small legacy congregation. And you can see, we have Drew and we have James. Those are the breadth of the experience of Mennonite congregations, and it's all a part of church planting. The legacy revisioning, and also I'm completely new to this, how do I join in? But there is a hunger for the Anabaptist vision and for peace churches, and we are responding to that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we're seeing this increased interest. It's a very exciting time.
I think it's also part of the fruit of a missional conversation that started 15 years ago with the formation of MCUSA. But we're realizing much more that to engage our neighbors in the way of, with the way of Jesus, kind of the Anabaptist understanding of what it means to follow, is going to take new wines, and it's a new wine and it needs new wineskins. And so God is doing something in our community, and we want to play a part in that. And in some ways, our traditional ways of approaching church are going to have to shift to accommodate, in some ways, to participate in what God is doing. So, so it's encouraging to me to see guys like you, Drew, that want to pastor the Mennonite Church and Anabaptist Mennonite Church.
Well, whoever's doing your social media stuff, tell them to keep up the good work. I've followed for the last 2 years when I found out about Mennonites, started following, and a lot of great energy, and it's been very attractional. So whoever that is, tell them to keep it up, because from someone completely on the outside, you've really done a great job communicating the energy and the excitement of the movement there. So
that's good to hear. Did you hear that, Kayla? So Kayla's one of the people that works on that team. Are there any other thoughts? It's 7:09. We Hilda or Vern, do you have anything else to share as we wrap up? Or okay. Oh, I think Vern is.
Okay, so I'll help Mauricio make the pitch for Sent 2019. We are a very tiny congregation. We look forward to sharing with many people. I had a wonderful time in Chicago last year at Sent 2018. I was very moved by it and inspired. And it is the connection between people who seem to be in motion in one way or the other for the sake of the work of the Spirit. Or like Michael just said, that often we are trying to join the work of the Spirit that's already underway, and how amazing that is. So if you come to Sent 2019, we're going to do hymns and blues and praise songs. and we're going to have a really good time, and we'll have a chance to interact and warm each other's hearts in the spirit of Christ, for sure. So I think it's a powerful moment, and I hope that people really consider that the goodness of that and can consider joining us.
Yeah. Thank you, Vern. Yeah. So this is the first time I've ever hosted a webinar, so I don't know how you end these things. I'll just be honest. If I were in my church, I'd know we would pray, because that's how we end. But if that's okay, does that seem appropriate for church planners and people to pray? Yeah, please join me. Join me in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for each person that is sharing this time together. And what an amazing thing that we can have this conversation when we're all in different places, and yet we're your people. One faith, one baptism, one Lord and Savior of all. And so we thank you for each person and their heart, their desire to see your church thrive, and for other people to come to know the goodness of what it means to follow Jesus, and to be in community, and to be at work, helping to create the shalom you desire for the world around us as churches. And so I pray that you'll bless each person as they consider the call that you're placing on their hearts. Be with Mauricio and Carla and the team at Mennonite Mission Network that's working to provide resources. Be with Vern and Hilda as they're on the front line in some ways, planting churches and engaging folks, and with all the church planners throughout our system. Will you be present with them, and may they know the strength of the support of the wider community, and be especially present with those planning for the Sent gathering. May that be a rich time of fellowship and encouragement and equipping for church planters in Mennonite Church USA and beyond. So we thank you for this time. I thank you for each one here, and go in peace. In Jesus' name, amen.